we're live, I think.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As-salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's tuning into our second episode of our Malcolm X series, looking into the storm, the successors of Malcolm X. My name is Isra Ibrahim, and inshallah, I will be joining in for this conversation today. So this second episode is part of a 9-episode educational series that is meant to introduce and analyze Malcolm X through historical speeches, texts, and events. But here at Milestones, we also recognize the importance of his legacy and offering a correct reading of how his legacy should be practiced by some of his successors who came after him. So inshallah, we'll be providing an overview of those successors that we'll be discussing in episodes after. And we'll also be deconstructing and analyzing Malcolm X through his Guerrillas to Mississippi interview. So today I'm joined with lovely familiar faces. You've seen them here before. You have Tanzim Doha, who is the general editor for Milestones and also an anthropologist of Islam. And also you have Brother Hanbal, who is an organizer and also special contributor to Milestones as well. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this conversation. So we hope to kind of continue start, but if you guys can give a few words about the series and why you are participating in it as well, that would be good.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think, for me, growing up, I always was really interested in some of these individuals. The way I was taught political theory was through a lot of like reading of Malcolm X's speeches, as well as some of the people that we're going to go over in this series. And, in the past, and especially this year with everything going on, but in the recent past, I found that a lot of people are really unfamiliar with some of these people. And I thought, they deserved some highlighting and they deserved to be centered in some of the conversations that we're having. And I think a lot of people could benefit just from hearing their names and knowing some of the things that they've done, inshallah.
Yeah.
Inshallah, I'd like to just assalamu alaikum to all the listeners and viewers and to you guys.
Alaikum assalam.
I would just like to say that one of the things that my brother Hanbal did last time was disturb the easy, simplified chronology of the Malcolm X story that we usually get, both from the beginning by talking about prior to Malcolm, how there's a whole history of where he comes from in terms of Marcus Garvey, his father, and then Garvey's connection to Islam. That's very important for us to understand that genealogy of struggle. And then after Malcolm, what happened to that history, and that there was actually a vibrant and continues to be a vibrant history of that. So I think this series to me is really significant because we're covering a really huge, and for me, because I'm actually interested in political theory, there is a huge interest for me to sort of shed light on that complexity, but also at the same time provide something for those of us who are interested in application of Malcolm's life and his theory in terms of understanding America. And those of us, our viewers who are part of the Islamic world and they are looking at how to think about America, Malcolm provides us really important analysis, and his successors also provide us with all kinds of approaches to how to engage with the antagonism that America has created with history itself. And so that's something for me is really significant. So I'm glad that we're kind of starting off with late Malcolm, and then today we can kind of end with the late Malcolm part and then move into the direction of the successors, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair both for those opening remarks. I'll just say quickly for me, I think my interest in being a part of this series as well is, I think for a lot of us, when we learn and understand Malcolm X, just like in organizing today, you see that Malcolm X is, sometimes sanitized, reappropriated a lot. And usually you see a Malcolm X face with one of his quotes, and then people just make any political assumptions you kind of want with that. And I think with this series, which is really important, is learning how to read Malcolm X in his late years, but also how his legacy is practiced and applied by certain successors as well, just so we can see like the continuation of that history and how that connects to us today, so we're not kind of like disconnected as well. So Jazakallah khair, guys, for those opening remarks. It was very helpful. And I just want to quickly say, we also, Milestones has a joint fundraiser with Black Dawah Network. We'll be providing it in the link below on our Facebook page, and we'll also be sending it via email. But if you guys can, please support us. It's very much appreciated. And again, for everyone who's tuning in right now, if you guys have comments and questions throughout this entire episode, please feel free to share them below. We want this to be an engagement, not just a monologue by a dialogue. So inshallah, we're going to be starting with our first clip of Malcolm X's interview, Guerrillas to the Mississippi. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started for us.
Malcolm, the Civil Rights Bill is with us now. What will it mean?
Well, I'm not very excited at all over the Civil Rights Bill, primarily because it's a law, and the Supreme Court desegregation decision was also a law that was handed down by the highest court in the land 10 years ago, and they haven't been able to implement it even here in New York City or any other city in the North, much less try and implement it in the South. And if they can't implement this single law that was handed down by the highest court in the land, I'm very doubtful that they'll be able to enforce any of the laws that are now on the books in this recently passed civil rights legislation.
You don't think it's even a step then?
No, I don't think it's any step. The Constitution of the United States automatically is supposed to be sufficient to protect anybody who's born here who's a citizen. And if the Constitution includes all of those who are born here, I don't see why additional legislation is needed when it comes to the rights of the Negro. If the who come here as refugees don't need civil rights legislation in order to be recognized as citizens, why, it's a farce to make Negroes think that civil rights legislation is needed to get us recognition as citizens.
Well,
yeah, so that was our first clip. And I think what Malcolm X is speaking right there is incredibly relevant in regards to this ongoing question within struggle today about the importance and justification and place of legislation, and also about whether legal avenues from campaigns to electoral voting can achieve for us necessary wins. But what I want to bring attention to and kind of discuss is the particular question that Malcolm raised, which is, why is additional legislation even necessary when there does exist a document called the Constitution that is supposed to be sufficient enough to ensure the rights of the Negro, to ensure the rights of all people. And I think what this question ultimately reveals is that the institution and enactment of these civil rights, like civil progress within American society, is not to be taken as a measure of progress of how far like Black people have come, but rather it's more of a measure of how far empire and like white civil society has to adapt to kind of contain a more violent resistance from erupting. So I think what empire and white civil society has to do, it has to have this adaptability function, so it can ensure its existence before, colonized and oppressed people just, decide to destroy it and whatnot. And I think also this is, again, an important question for those of us in struggle to kind of consider, that no one is going to give you freedom if you just simply ask for it. Like, we have bills, and we can't just rely on the state or government to enact them with justice and, fully, but it's something that you have to continually fight and sacrifice for. And this isn't to say that certain legal campaigns are not important or not necessary, but it's to say that it's not the end all be all of struggle, because they are, by definition, they're short-sighted. They're not all encompassing enough to achieve a justice for the colonized and oppressed people, to be able to achieve a justice that necessitates the destruction of like a Western colonial paradigm. So I think these questions about like the limits of legality and framework has to, by definition, kind of include all this, because we need to understand that when we study and read history, our starting points can be from something like, we were always oppressed, and now over time we're increasing a participation in American civil society or electoral voting, but also understanding that kind of narrative, that kind of false narrative kind of just eviscerates when we understand the history of kind of colonization and the history of colonized and oppressed people in the US currently. So I want to go, I guess, to Brother Hanbal to add to that or bring up additional points as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I take away from it is like, like you're saying, this isn't a measure of progress. And, this is what Malcolm was telling us, is that if you really look at it critically, what we're looking at with the efforts and orientation towards new laws, if, in my opinion, if it further dehumanizes Black people, because it is as if to say, these original laws that were meant for all people don't apply to you because you're Black. We need some extra laws to humanize you and to protect you as a Black person. And that's like, the most optimistic kind of reading. And then on the other side of it, we have to think critically, like ultimately it's a strategic appeasement of struggle, that Black people are struggling for a better quality of life. And instead of providing them with respect and dignity and, treating them as equals, or treating them as, as human beings, etc., it's something that is meant to say, well, here's a law, go home and be quiet. You know what I mean? Like, you achieved this law, celebrate it, call it a victory, and, dismantled all of this movement stuff because we're now making progress with these laws. And I think, we can see similar kinds of gestures. It's like a token kind of gesture when you think about it, because there was already laws that should have protected us. There's laws upon laws upon laws. And if you look at even the punishment or enforcement of laws, there's punishments upon punishments upon punishments being applied to Black people, taking, 13% of the population and making them between 40 and 60% of a prison population, depending on what area you're looking at. And, there's all kind of penal codes and punishments that are being applied to Black people, but for some reason, they're not getting their rights. They're not getting the rights that they're supposed to be afforded under the Constitution. And so, there's no shortage of laws, but we have to recognize the fact that we already had laws in place, and those laws didn't protect us. And so the question isn't about more writing up more bills, or writing Black Lives Matter, painting Black Lives Matter on the street in DC, or other places, or naming a street after a Black person. You know what I mean? Like I'd be happy to live on on David
Malcolm
Duke
X
Street.
Avenue.
I'd be happy to live on David Duke Street, you know, if they're going to treat me with respect and dignity, if my family's safe, and if we're able to live in a good quality of life. I don't care what the name of the street is. Personally, that's my personal perspective on it.
Yeah.
So when you see like certain laws and certain gestures like that are really just token gestures, to me it's insulting, because it's like, we're asking for quality of life. You know, we're not asking for you to write more stuff on a piece of paper, for you to name more stuff in a different name. You know, we're struggling for the quality of life for ourselves, for our community, for our children, and, you know, future generations, you know. So that's my perspective on that one.
Can I add my 2 cents to it?
Yeah.
The Constitution is for the human, and Black people are not treated as human according to the Constitution. 3/5 of a human being. We know from other theories that we learned, who got inspired by Malcolm's more radical position, that the Constitution is simply a continuation of the civil society, which is based on Black death. So of course, Malcolm X does not find any hope in these kinds of conversations about what the power structure thinks about new laws and new legislation. You cannot legislate brotherhood. That's what he says. So it's an ethical question. It's a question of actually finding a new kind of political orientation, even a new document probably. And so the whole way that we're kind of looking at Malcolm's history is finding that kind of groundbreaking thinking that's not really about continuing with the way history is already organized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's it makes a lot of sense. And again, it goes to like how people are analyzing even like these very frameworks, again, about, you know, the progress of civil rights, of civic participation, because it's growing. And, you know, just because it's growing, it's somehow kind of a progress of like Black people's movement and position within American civil society, but not realizing that it's empire trying to kind of save itself, because they realize, you know, there's rebellions and riots, and they understand that they have to adapt and appease the people so they don't continue rioting, basically. Yeah. I want to go to the next 2 clips where Malcolm X talks about education and also guerrilla warfare, and more about the self-defense of communities. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up as well.
What would you suggest be done then to let a Negro go wherever he wants to in the South and get all the other benefits that the bill provides him?
You can't do anything by legislation. It takes education. The white man in this country needs to be re-educated so that his behavior pattern toward non-whites will change, and the Black man in this country also needs to be re-educated so our behavior pattern and attitude toward ourselves will change. And once a little educating is done on both sides, you'll probably find that that in itself will do more to bring about the spirit of brotherhood than all of the legislation that's designed to force the two together. You can't legislate brotherhood. Brotherhood comes about through understanding, and understanding is created through education.
Now, Malcolm, on one side you're talking about brotherhood and education, and on the other side you're talking about guerrilla movements in the South. Where do you stand?
Both of them are educational. We demand our right to have access to equality of opportunity to anything that this country stands for, as long as we're born here and come within the confines of the Constitution that governs this country. Now, in line with that, we feel that we have the right to defend ourselves whenever we take measures to participate as citizens, and unlawful elements like the Ku Klux Klan get in our way. We think the two positions are consistent. In fact, one complements the other.
Malcolm, tell me why you want to send guerrillas to Mississippi.
Well, Professor Mark DeWolf Howell of the Harvard Law School, speaking for 29 other law professors, pointed out that the United States government could intervene by law in the state of Mississippi by sending troops. And since the Attorney General and others in the federal government have pointed out that they don't intend to send federal troops in themselves to protect the lives and the property of the Negroes who are being brutalized down there, it's our intention to try and organize the black people or the American Negroes in this country into self-defense units in that area, in areas where the government is unwilling or unable to defend our people. We will defend our people ourselves.
Just what exactly would these units do? Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth situation?
Well, as long as it is an intelligently organized effort that is being made, the discipline involved will keep our people acting intelligently and discriminately. But if something isn't done in this country to organize Negroes who are fed up with this nonviolent, turn-the-other-cheek approach in a sensible direction to bring about the halting of this brutality that we're constantly the victims of, then Negroes are going to react in a disorganized way, in an unintelligent way, and an indiscriminate way when it comes to retaliation. So we actually think that we're doing more to uphold the law and protecting the lives and property of our people in an organized way than to sit around and let a disorganized effort develop.
What would you do in a specific case, say, of the 3 missing boys right now?
Well, one of the things I would do if I wanted to find them, I would look in the police station in Mississippi. And when you think in terms of the Ku Klux Klan as being the ones who are responsible for them being missing, then in the state of Mississippi, most of the policemen belong to the Klan. The two organizations are interwoven with each other. So we would look in some of the police stations or start questioning the police. There's no need to question the people out there in the street. The police know more about where these persons are, whether they're dead or alive, than anyone else in Mississippi.
When you say you'd question the police, do you really think you'd get them to talk to you?
No. So it means that we've reached the point where talking is a waste of time.
What would you do?
It has become necessary for the American Negro, of which there are 22 million, to go on record to let the world know that since the American government in Washington, D.C. has proven its unwillingness or its inability to protect us in the state of Mississippi, the black man in this country is obligated to take it upon himself to organize and put forth the efforts that are necessary to give our people the protection that has not been forthcoming from the government. Well, the alternative is that the federal government, which is supposed to protect the rights of Negroes the same as it protects the rights of whites, must take the responsibility of recognizing the fact that the state of Mississippi is part of the United States and is under the jurisdiction of the United States government, and therefore the United States government is responsible for all of the violence, the bloodshed, and brutality that takes place in Mississippi. And in the past, as long as our people have been the victim of brutality, the government has dragged its feet. So we have to create a situation where we can retaliate and create a situation that will force the United States government to occupy the state of Mississippi and do for us in protecting us as she has done for others while trying to protect others.
Yeah, so that was definitely a lot of things that Malcolm mentioned. So a lot about first his concept of education, and one about organizing intelligent efforts and whatnot. What I kind of want to speak to is Malcolm's kind of conception of education. I think just personally speaking for me and for like other young people working to organize ourselves within struggle today, I think when we hear education, we kind of have an adverse reaction to it, just because a lot of times when education is presented to us, it's presented as an avenue to kind of pacify the militancy of resistance, to appease, radical language, and simply just wants to kind of reduce the conditions of like the oppressed and colonized, captured people to a cultural issue and whatnot. And, a lot of these, education webinars or talks by a lot of people in like kind of mainstream activist environments and kind of discourse happens kind of at the intersection of state, So, you invite police officers talking about, education. How do we educate people as if as if our conditions is an issue of a miseducation, right? And I think this ultimately what it does is it reduces it to a cultural question, it reduces it to a civic question, and of course it doesn't ultimately directly threaten the state or the political economy that is the root of our oppression. So when I hear Malcolm evoking guerrilla warfare in the same sentence when he's talking about education and how they're kind of complementary to each other, it's kind of like a breath of fresh air. And you understand that his understanding of what is actually taking place is very dynamic and like a very holistic view of struggle. And I think also his point about organizing intelligent efforts for like self-defense, I think is a way for us to understand when we should be intelligent and not being reactionary with other people in the movements who we might have disagreements with, but to understand how strategic unity is pivotal to that. So if Hanbel, if you have additional points as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's like you said, it's really important to put in context what he's talking about with regard to education. Like Malcolm talks about an education to change attitudes. He's not merely talking about an education to say, well, here's what the laws on the books are. He's talking about a type of education that's going to transform people's attitudes. He talks about an education that's going to change Black people's attitude towards themselves and each other, which is very important to take into consideration, because even even at the level of even if you consider Black people as having these rights, etc., Black people don't have a general attitude of we deserve our rights, we deserve to be able to defend ourselves, defend our property, we deserve to be able to defend our dignity, our quality of life, etc. There's like a general attitude as if stay within the limits of what white people are comfortable with, and then there's a general attitude on the part of the I would say of the general population of whites, but then more specifically the sort of hardline racist elements within the white community, which is that Black people don't have a right to anything, that they don't have any rights, that a Black person that Black people don't have any rights that a white person is obligated to respect, and I think that that's at the core of it. And Malcolm talks about how he's questioned, well, you're talking about education and brotherhood on one side, and then you're talking about guerrilla movements in the South, and he says very plainly that both are educational. And so he gives us a better look into what he means by education. He doesn't mean merely sit in a classroom and talk about history. He means people need to be educated as to, this is why you don't infringe on Black people's rights. This is why you don't violate Black people. This is why you don't hurt Black people, because there's going to be consequences, and those consequences help change attitudes. It's an educational process. By providing those consequences, it educates Black people that they are worthy beings, that their dignity is valuable, that their quality of life is valuable and important. And it's also a process of educating whites that if you think you're just going to trample us and you think you're just going to treat us any kind of way and infringe upon us, that you're going to be facing consequences, and those consequences are going to hurt, and those consequences are going to be like in nature to the kind of violence that they're subjecting us to, that they're subjecting our people, our community to, and so this is the kind of education that Malcolm was talking about. He wasn't merely talking about reading books. He wasn't talking about, going to a university and getting a university degree, and that degree liberates you and makes you free. He was talking about a kind of education that will change attitudes on both sides of the equation. That Black people need to have an attitude towards other Black people and towards themselves, that they are a worthy being of their rights, and I would say they're God-given rights, because we have rights that go above and beyond, this state, this government, this territory, this nation, etc. Our rights go above and beyond that. And those rights can't merely be forsaken because we're Black. Those rights can't merely be forsaken because we have a history of being in a vulnerable position. And so he's talking about a process of educating people to change their attitudes, towards those things. And I think that's really important. Another thing within the clip that he talks about, and I think this too goes to the point of education, is something must be done to organize, as he says, Negroes who are fed up with this nonviolent turn the other cheek approach. And I think that rings especially true today, because there's a whole element of the Black community, of the Black population, that is not and has never been down with getting beat on, and has never been down with turning the other cheek. That's not the way I was raised, and many other people I grew up with, and many of the people in my community that I'm close to would simply never have been okay with turning the other cheek. We simply never have been okay with getting beat on, accepting abuse, just tolerating abuse for the sake of being in unity with certain other elements who believe that that's the moral high ground. And we've never believed that allowing yourself to be abused is a moral high ground. It's not a moral high ground to tolerate abuse from morally corrupt people, tolerating abuse from cowards, and anyone else. It's not a moral high ground to tolerate abuse, And so he's saying that something must be done to organize that element of Black people, to organize those Negroes who are fed up with that approach. And I think even to this day, there's like a general fear and disdain that's given towards those type of Black people who say, we've had enough with getting beat on. We want to do something. We're personally willing to make sacrifices if need be, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a general attitude towards them of, fear, mistrust, that they're dangerous, or somehow crazy. And this goes back to the ideas of drapetomania that come out of slavery, that if a slave is willing to rise up against, an organized force of white people in slavery, that he must be crazy. I mean, doesn't he know how powerful the white man is? He has to be crazy to think like that, right? And I think people still are consistent with that attitude today. I think people still harbor that attitude today, that if Black people actually want to fight back or want to sacrifice and take personal sacrifices for the sake of advancing the quality of life of Black people, that somehow they're crazy. Somehow, that they have to be insane to want to do that, And I think that, Malcolm hits the nail right on the head when he says that something must be done to organize that element of Black people, and whatever that may be. I don't necessarily think I'm an expert on that to say like it has to be done like this or that. I think we do have certain leadership within our community that have provided really positive examples. I think that's, one of the main reasons of this series, but it's something that people really have to grapple with, that question of, okay, getting beyond the fear. When you have Black people who are no longer afraid of oppressors, who are no longer afraid of abuse, who are willing to accept personal sacrifices, what do you do with them? What must they do? What's the responsible thing for them to do? You can't just tell them to go sit in a corner and continue to accept abuse, or go sit in the corner and watch Black people continue to be abused. Exactly, I don't think that's a moral high ground. I don't think that's an ethical approach, and so, Malcolm hits the nail right on the head. And then further to the point, he says, to organize them is to prevent indiscriminate violence. And what he's saying is that if you don't organize that element, then what you're going to see is a type of chaos and indiscriminate violence that's not going to be effective, that's not going to have a direction, that's not going to be going towards improving the quality of life for Black people, but it's just going to be sort of like a chaotic, just a chaotic, indiscriminate violence, right? And he makes the point to say, that he's not talking about attacking white people indiscriminately, but he's talking about targeted resistance, targeted defense, and targeted retaliation on the Ku Klux Klan and Ku Klux Klan types of groups who are completely committed to violence, who are operating with the protection of law enforcement, who are operating within the institutions of law enforcement, and who are taking advantage of those privileges in order to do indiscriminate violence to Black people, in order to abuse and violate, Black man, woman, and child. He's not talking about indiscriminate violence against white man, woman, and child. He's talking about targeting people who are actively engaged in doing these things. And he says this kind of organizing or education, if you will, is what is one of the only things that can give a sensible direction to the type of rage, that is naturally going to come out of Black people. When Black people see Black women and children continue to be abused, naturally there's going to be a rage that comes out of us. And Malcolm says something must be done to organize that element. Otherwise, it's not going to have a sensible direction. And I think that's a very key question that, Black leaders today, or quote unquote leaders are dodging it like the plague. I mean, they're dodging that question like it's COVID-19, so that's where I'm gonna finish my points there.
Yeah, and I think just quickly, because we have a question directly speaking to what you're talking about, I want to bring it up. But why are mainstream Muslim leaders not specifically talking about the legitimacy of a physical response to oppression in terms of our religion? I've been to several online discussions in response to the murder of George Floyd, and no one talks about what Islam says about our rights to fight back. So I think I quickly just want to say that I think what tends to happen is even people who watch these discussions somehow have this assumption that these mainstream Muslim leaders are like outside of a political economy, that they somehow transcend the state, that they're not like social subjects who are actively pacified, that are actively playing a certain role. So I think it comes down to us as well to understand that just because we have figures of religious authority and they, give us, sometimes important information and whatnot, I think we have to critically understand that certain Muslim mainstream leaders are playing a specific role of like a pacified leadership that wants to kind of like assimilate within civil society and whatnot. And I think when we understand that, it also kind of helps us, take back the power over how we want our actions to be interpreted. Because I know for at least a lot of young people who are starting to be radicalized and whatnot, they feel that every time that they are appeased or pacified by Muslim leadership, mainstream Muslim leadership, that somehow there's something wrong with them. The point that Hannibal said about long ago, people thinking with slaves fighting back against the white men or whatever, that somehow there's something wrong with them, something spiritually wrong with them, mentally wrong with them. And I think that's something we have to be actively talking about and not backing down from it, because it's a very critical question. We can't let, pacified Muslim mainstream leadership and Black leadership as well to kind of take over or be the sole authority of what Islam says about fighting back against oppression, because we understand that they themselves are social subjects playing a specific role of trying to pacify people's, responses. So I wanted, like, you guys can also answer that too.
Yeah,
as well.
if you don't mind, I want to piggyback on that too, because
Yeah.
this is something this is a kind of logic that's kind of typically attributed to Christianity. But if we look at the historical co-optation of Christianity by the Roman Empire, we see that, them trying to use scripture and trying to use religion as a basis of suppressing the uprising of the peasantry, of the oppressed, of the original Christians, etc. And so you find that they start inserting this logic into the religion that you're supposed to merely go along to get along, and that allowing yourself to be abused is a spiritual moral high ground. And I would say that this is state religion. This isn't monotheism, but this is the religion of the state. This is the religion of the empire, which doesn't want you to take apart its power. They don't want you to take apart their mechanisms of power, so they teach you to obey, to accept, and just accept any type of abuse. Now, I would argue that it's not even fundamental to Christianity, that when you have examples of Isa or Jesus, alayhi salam, turning over the tables of the money changers, whipping these people inside of the temple. These are stories that tend to get like overshadowed by this turn the other cheek approach. But the reality of the situation is the historical example of Jesus was that he was actually fighting against that, right? But there's nothing in Islam that teaches to turn the other cheek. There's nothing in Islam that teaches people to accept and tolerate abuse. In fact, we're actually called to fight oppression. And the highest form of faith is to change it with your hands. The second is to use your words and speak against it. And then the weakest form of faith is to hate it in your heart. Some of these people don't even hate it in their heart. So such a person is without faith, and one of the ways that we act on our faith is to straight up fight against oppression. And this is a source of hasanat. This is a source of risk from Allah for us to gain good deeds, and for us to put good deeds in our record on the day of judgment, is to actually fight back against oppression.
Yeah. And Tantine, if you want to answer that question, and also go to your point again about, guerrilla warfare and what Malcolm is speaking towards.
Yeah, inshallah. As far as the question by the audience, I mean, it's basically, Islam is very clear. There's a jurisprudence and law of retaliation in a specific way that we're allowed to retaliate and justly retaliate. So Islam is a huge discourse. It's a very attractive religion for those who want to fight back. So I would invite our brothers and sisters who are oppressed to learn about Islam more, because it'll give you a religious right to retaliate. Sort of common sense Christian notion of how understands retaliation almost as a bad word, like you can't say it. We literally have chapters under that heading explaining how to retaliate, which part of the body to attack if we get attacked, what can be targeted, etc. So it's a very robust, rich kind of discourse on retaliation. God allows human beings to retaliate against violence that happens to them. So it's a form of worship when we fight against oppression. Fighting against oppression is a form of ibadah. So Islam is a beautiful religion that allows for that. Malcolm understood that very clearly. And in fact, he would go to certain people, and when he saw them to be fairly intelligent, he would ask them, why are you not Muslim yet? It was a rhetorical question, was actually a literal question from Malcolm. He would go to Black historians who understood certain things and ask them, why aren't they engaging with Islam more? Now, going back to the point about education and guerrilla warfare and that excerpt that we just listened to, I think, Isra, your point is very important about how education is misrepresented often by the civil society, whether it's Muslim civil society, Black civil society, white civil society. whatever color. They use education as a way, which Hanbal was saying also, in an institutional way to continue how the order of things are, to maintain that order. Education is the number one go-to. And of course, using legislation as the other excuse to stop political action from actually changing the world, or actually attempting to change how the world is organized. So I think Malcolm's understanding there, and the fact that he calls guerrilla warfare education, he's very interested, it's clear that education there is interested in changing the material ground that allows for a particular understanding of what is human and what is not human. And for him, when the people in the South are going to take up arms to fight against the racists, it will actually be a form of self-realization of someone who now stands up as a human being and is demanding respect as a human being. And so for Malcolm, this is foundational to actually change what is considered almost like human nature, to expect slaves to obey. And the word that Malcolm used in different speech was that when you have that kind of pacifism, it's sort of, they use the phrase that Malcolm used was Novocaine, which is what you use in a dental surgery. You're gonna feel a lot of pain, and it's unnatural. It's natural for you to fight back and move because you're feeling pain. So the surgeon would put Novocaine so you don't feel anything. And the function of religion can become that. And that's what Hanbal was talking about as state religion. So I think there's a number of things happening there. So in that excerpt, I was very, when I read late Malcolm, it's so exciting to see how he appreciates the Islamic world, because there's this legacy of struggle in which Muslims do not just talk about what their rights are with the oppressor, they actually fight back. So Malcolm was inspired by that. And so when you think about, like, even if you think about certain portions, like when Hamas is sending rockets, Israel has to respect them as the enemy. They have to treat them like, man, you never know what these people might do. What that means is that you're demanding that you're now educated that these brothers and sisters in Palestine, they're going to fight back. You're educated on that, you see? So in other words, what's happening here is linking dawah, education as information sharing about Islam, and jihad, linking the two and showing people that through political action, there's a lot of education that happens. It's not always in a classroom, or in an institution or in the academy. And I think that's a really important and significant point. So it's not the typical, liberal education and whatnot, nor is it the typical political education of the social justice warriors. They just talk about what to do and how to manipulate in the name of pragmatism. It's actually about changing the foundations of the world. And I think that's really key in that excerpt.
Yeah. And I think just hearing you speak about that, I think it's just very refreshing to speak about that with, in regards to like jihad and Muslims' rights, like fighting back. I think it's very, very important. I want to go on to a next clip, inshallah. This one will be a very short one, but basically Malcolm is speaking about sending people into battle without training.
Is a waste of time.
What would you do?
It has become necessary for the American Negro, of which there are 22 million, to go on record to let the world know that since the American government in Washington, D.C. has proven its unwillingness or its inability to protect us in the state of Mississippi, the black man in this country is obligated to take it upon himself to organize and put forth the efforts that are necessary to give our people the protection that has not been forthcoming from the government. Well, the alternative is that the federal government, which is supposed to protect the rights of Negroes the same as it protects the rights of whites, must take the responsibility of recognizing the fact that the state of Mississippi is part of the United States and is under the jurisdiction of the United States government, and therefore the United States government is responsible for all of the violence, the bloodshed, and brutality that takes place in Mississippi. And in the past, as long as our people have been the victim of brutality, the government has dragged its feet. So we have to create a situation where we can retaliate and create a situation that will force the United States government to occupy the state of Mississippi and do for us in protecting us as she has done for others while trying to protect others.
This is your goal.
We would not say, I would not say.
Would they need training?
Oh yes, anytime you are sending people against an enemy on the front lines, they need training. And the only criticism that I have of the students who have been sent in, I think that the organization that sent these students in to show our people there how to become involved in this voters registration is a great step. And the whites involved should be given credit as well as the Negroes who will receive the benefit of it. All of them should be given credit. But I believe that they made a tactical mistake in sending these young people in and not showing them how to defend themselves, because to send them in this area with no idea of how to defend themselves against the brutal attacks of the Klan is equivalent to sending soldiers on the front lines in Korea or in South Vietnam or Laos. And that enemy over there is nowhere near as vicious as the Klan and the White Citizens Council and other racist elements in this country.
You mentioned that you would use white people to...
Yeah, so Hanbet, if you want to kind of respond to that point.
Yeah, you know, in listening to this interview, I thought this was really critical because on a number of levels. One, that kind of approach of having training is something that has been, I would argue, has been strategically removed or strategically targeted. Those people who would provide such training have been historically targeted and put under all kinds of pressure that inhibited their ability to provide that role in the community. And then furthermore, even taking it beyond merely like physical confrontations, which is very important to consider. It's very important for people to have that kind of training, but taking it to the level of political battle, right? So, and you know, one could say during the time that he gave this interview that there were a number of organizations that were doing different types of political training for young people and the community in general, training people how to mobilize and organize in different ways. But today, it seems that people are being trained on how to be more and more passive. So, you know, young people are rising up and, you know, certain quote unquote leaders and certain influential individuals find ways to create these like pacification trainings and, you know, to water down the effectiveness of organizing by, you know, training people to center certain types of politics. For example, there's like these uprisings that pop up, and then there are people who are trained to strategically infiltrate into the organizing and steer it and orient it towards the nonprofit industrial complex, towards the Democratic Party, and in general towards, how can you say, steering it towards these you know, measurable, containable things that nonprofit organizations and you know, Democratic Party, et cetera, can claim as victories to their funding, to their funders, things that they can claim as successes, that they can claim as proof of their effectiveness as organizations. So they're steering people in terms of, you know, what they can put in their books and what they can continue to get funding and what they can use to legitimize more funding, instead of orienting and training people towards making the movement itself more effective towards its interests, towards its goals and purposes. That why are people uprising? you know, and I refer back to quality of life, because we can talk about laws upon laws upon laws, but ultimately we're fighting for quality of life. So all of our orientation should be directed towards the quality of life. So those are the goals, should be focused and fixed on improving the quality of life for Black people. But somehow we have all of these groups and organizations that come in and they center goals of the Democratic Party. They center goals of their specific nonprofits, which ensure and guarantee them more funding. And I think young people are largely not trained to deal with that. You know, I think it's rare actually that young people are even fully aware of the mechanisms in place. I think some older generations, people who've been dealing with these groups for a long time, tend to be sharper on this stuff. But then after a while, you start to get kind of cast in this light of, you know, conspiracy theorist type of thing. But you know, if you look on the records of these groups and where their money comes from and what type of policies they've promoted in the past, then you can actually trace these patterns and you can trace the direction of these activities, that they come in, they don't create uprisings, they don't create massive mobilizations, they come into them and infiltrate into them and steer it towards something that they can measure and claim as a victory to their funders, or something that can be steered towards, you know, maybe getting Democrats elected locally, or even steered towards, you know, getting Biden elected, or any number of watered down compromises that they like to claim as victories. So they infiltrate and introduce these compromises into movement, and then you know, rhetorically, on paper, et cetera, claim these things as victories. And so there needs to be a training for young people on how to be effective political organizers, how to maintain the direction of their movement, how to steer their own movements, which they create, because a lot of these uprisings and things that we're looking at is created and generated by young people. And then you have organizations that come in and steer it. So young people need the training on how to maintain the direction that they're headed in, how to maintain their focus on what their actual goals are, which is quality of life for Black people, improving the quality of life. And they need to be trained on how to protect themselves against this kind of infiltration and co-optation, along with the necessary training of physical defense. Because as we pull away power from the police, as we pull away power from the hegemony, we're going to be dealing with these white vigilantes. We're going to be dealing with armed white people who deputize themselves and do violence to us. We're going to be dealing with these Ku Klux Klan type organizations. And so, you know, as we make progress and as young people progress towards their goals and the movements that they're creating and generating, they need to be also prepared to defend the progress that they make. They need to be prepared to defend the direction that they decide. They need to be prepared to defend their leadership. They need to be prepared to defend themselves and to continue on the path that they've created for themselves.
Yeah, no, and to even add just a very short points to that. One, a lot of these, like these trainings, and again, educational webinars, they're pacifist, but also they're kind of constructed in a way where they're very scattered and disconnected. So you have like, you know, an entire sector for like housing activism, or, you know, something specific for Black lives or whatnot. So I think even within the construction of like these pacifist trainings and webinars, they're also very scattered and kind of disconnected. And I think also your point about understanding that those responsible for these trainings, like the nonprofit sector and other actors, just kind of looking at their funding and what gets their fund, what kind of finances them. I think just a very important point that I think everybody can agree on is that no state or institution is going to fund its own rebellion or destruction. I think that's just a very logical step we can kind of agree on. And if you want to answer a question Hanbal, uh, from one of the attendees. I'll just read it here. How can you know what you don't have until you, in terms of travel, in terms of quality of life until you travel? Do you think travel is important for African American youth, not just training, especially in terms of experiencing what a better quality of life could be where their rights as people are respected? For example, I had the chance to go to Algeria for 2 weeks this past January and learned a lot. So just kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. Like, I haven't been many places. I traveled to South Africa a couple of times. So I'm not really an expert on that particular question, but what I can say to that is that I've had the privilege of having mentors and having people around me who did travel a lot more than I did. And so their perspectives were influenced in that way. And, and even Malcolm himself, when we're listening to him speak, etc., we're listening to someone who traveled. We're listening to someone who traveled throughout Africa, who traveled in throughout these Arab nations, and someone who had a great deal of interaction with international organizers, people of international influence, and with people from different backgrounds. And I would also add to that, his own background as his parents being members of the Guerrillas movement, which was an international phenomenon. The influence in their thinking that we see that consistently comes through from people like Dusay Muhammad Ali, who was a Sudanese Egyptian. We see that there's this broader perspective about what life should be like. And we see that, Malcolm constantly reiterates to us that it's not a question of civil rights. It's not a question of, your life here in America. It's a question of, the collective plight of Black people. And only by engaging with the rest of the world and understanding ourselves to be international or global people, that's the only way for us to truly understand how to improve our quality of life. So I think that's a very important question. I mean, when I'm able to, I plan to travel more. And I wish I had been able to do that more when I was even younger. But, I'm thankful for the influences I had. And I think it's a very important question. I think, and I think this is one of the major flaws in the thinking of the ADOS movement, is that they get kind of pigeonholed into this kind of thinking that doesn't take into account what other people are experiencing around the world, that doesn't take into account the connectedness, the interconnectedness of all Black people and all the struggles of oppressed people in other parts of the world, and something else to say on top of all of that, because we do hear these kinds of discussions about making hijra. We find that a lot of Black Muslims are discussing making hijra away from America. My understanding is we're dealing with a global power structure. We're dealing with a global white power structure. And so, there's really not a safe haven in the world. To one degree or another, that influence and that kind of violence and subjugation is pretty much everywhere in the world, but that doesn't take away from the value and what you can learn from traveling and what you can learn from having deep engagements with people from other places, so I think it's very important, but I don't think how some people, and I'm not to say that this is what the comment was saying or the question was saying, but I know that I've been privy to some conversations where people are just saying, well, we just got to make hijra away from America. And I find that to not be sufficient. I think that it's a global battle and it's a global struggle. So we do have to connect with people in other places, but we have a very important role to play here. And it must be played here. And there's a very important battle that must happen right here in America.
Yeah, and just for those of you who don't know, Hijra is basically like kind of the Islamic migration referencing when the Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina, just so to add that context. And it's very important concept also within like Islamic struggle, Islamic political struggle. So I want to bring Tanzeen in to also add to those points as well.
Yeah, I was going to add more, but I think Hanbal kind of covered it, but I'll just quickly say that travel, I mean, so this is not a direct response to the question. I think that's a very good question, and Hanbal really covered it really well. Travel is really significant and important and can have really influential kind of quality to it, to someone who's trying to think about other modes of life. However, what I don't like politically is when people use travel as a form of escaping struggle,
Mm.
and it actually, and then doing commentary from the outside as if, it's kind of this hierarchical way of being condescending about those who find themselves in struggle in different places, and then doing commentary on it by finding a location outside. So if there is no sense of how global the struggle is, and then in that global dimension, someone can actually help the struggle, that is very significant, right? So our dear brothers and sisters who are contacting me from Bangladesh and Malaysia and other places, and they're talking about different things that are happening, there's a different kind of productive and generative interaction. But when travel becomes a way to kind of say that, well, I'm not in it. It's because Malcolm X talked about that. When he returned back at the airport, he said, my name is still Malcolm X because all these millions of Black people are still subjugated and they haven't found a solution yet. And I can't just escape. I'm going to continue to have that X. I'm not just Ilhaj Malik al-Shabazz, because not everybody has become that, and they didn't find a kind of resolution in their life. So he was all about engaging in a dynamic struggle against America. And I think that is really important to do. So we can't use this hijrah as an excuse to leave struggle. And I think we should spiritually be very careful when we consider that, to make sure that the intentions are absolutely 100% clear, that it's not this big talk from the outside, when people are dying literally. And so I'm not interested in that kind of travel because I think it actually another form of pacifism is literally the Novocaine in a different kind of format. So yeah, inshallah, I think those are some good points that Hanbal made. We have to engage in struggle here. Those of us who are here and the brothers and sisters who are listening, we have to engage in struggle. If something really significant happened starting in Minneapolis, is going through a phase which is now, is kind of toned down. That's the cycle of struggle. But we have to find ourselves in different avenues. We have to find ourselves in economies that are like the ghetto economy, the prison economy, all those different areas where we have to engage. We can't be these kind of detached individuals who in the name of purification of the soul just escape. We're not going to do that. That's not the point of this webinar. The idea is to make us grounded, for sure.
No, thank you so much, Tanzeen, for that. Yeah, I think it's very important. I think just in general, just activist discourse here in the US just tends to be very domesticated. And if I can just escape empire here, I'll be safe somewhere else. Not understanding you kind of exist within like a totalizing like political economy. And I think while we are here to also be active, intentional about creating engagements, like political engagements and relationships with people outside. And I think that's something we're going to try to do a lot more, inshallah, with milestones as well. So I want to go ahead to the next clip. And this one is going to be about Malcolm X talking about whites' position in relationship and struggle. So
infiltrate the Klan to gather intelligence.
Yes, in my speaking engagements around the country on the various campuses, I have found many young whites who were sincere in their desire to see an end brought to racism. And many of them are now actively involved in SNCC and the nonviolent approach, But those same ones who are involved in the nonviolent approach would become involved in any approach that they thought would bring an end to racism. And I think that most whites as well as blacks can see that from experience in Mississippi and other parts of the South, the racist element there are too morally bankrupt to react in a positive way to the nonviolent approach.
Could you trust a person who belonged to the group that you used to call the Blue-Eyed Devils with information? Could you trust his information?
When I referred to them as the Blue-Eyed Devils, I was speaking for Elijah Muhammad. When I referred to them as a race of devils, I was speaking then for Elijah Muhammad. And I don't speak for Elijah Muhammad today. In fact, if Elijah Muhammad is the leader of the black people in this country, as he professes, then he should be concerned with the brutal treatment that our people are receiving in the state of Mississippi and send his well-trained Fruit of Islam down there to protect our people instead of sending them out here in the street to attack former Muslims who don't want to go along with his program anymore.
You would trust a white man's information, though?
Well, I have gotten information from whites in the past, even while I was a member of the Black Muslim movement, that I found to be pretty authentic.
Yeah, so I think just like Malcolm X providing just like a very, like just his experience and history with whites and what kind of whites were the ones who he was trusted and who gave him, specific information. And so kind of what I want to talk about is kind of today, the kind of mainstream reactionary identity politics that we find in activist discourse. So you have like a lot of extremes. So on one hand, you have this extreme over-focus on like white allyship and how to teach whites to be more culturally sensitive, how to make them respect, Black people's dreads and things like that. And these kind of cultural conversations usually happen kind of at the intersection of like state and the academy and whatnot. And again, it's like reduced and struggled to one of like a cultural issue. But also you have on the other hand, what you witnessed kind of recently during George Floyd protests was that the same reactionary identity politics pushed by a lot of like radical liberals was that you see this kind of public outing of whites who destroyed property or did property damage during those protests alongside brown and Black people, and basically being outed in the public and even given to the police. So one specific example I want to reference was the case of Rayshard Brooks, who was murdered by police next to a Wendy's. And the same kind of reactionaries online, what they did was they figured out that his white girlfriend who put the Wendy's on fire, they basically added her out because she was white and, kind of playing into this narrative of like, the violent whites or the whites who cause this property damage are the ones making us look bad and whatnot. And of course, there's a lot of this plays into a lot of assumptions about respectability politics, proving to the police and state we're not the violent ones, it's actually these violent whites, which is just a very unintelligent and reactionary view of whites' positions and participation in struggle, and also about police. So I think we have very obvious questions about what white participation in struggle could look like if they're willing to commit like political suicide to let go of social capital and in terms of like, bringing about freedom and whatnot. But I think we also kind of have to re-examine currently like this phenomenon of a very extreme reactionary identity politics that is happening and is also used as a way to accuse and malign more militant Black radicals who do utilize, for example, white accomplices to either do property damage of institutions and police cars and whatnot. So I think those would be like my points there. But if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much content there. There's so much important discussion there that needs to be had with regard to what Malcolm is saying, and even like some of the contemporary examples that you bring up. That's a very important conversation. we've tried to touch on it in the past, and it's something that I think, we'll have to continually revisit. What is white people's role in the struggle? And I think, as far as in the struggle for Black liberation, because that's what ultimately, when we talk about the successors of Malcolm, I don't think it's necessarily limited to that, because the scope of Malcolm's work was so important to the world that, he didn't just benefit Black people, and he wasn't just a leader of Black people, but he was a leader of a whole lot of people. But and including those dedicated anti-racist white people. Malcolm was their leader too, and I think that there is some acknowledgement that's necessary, because it's like you said, there's like this schizophrenic approach where it's like, on the one hand, whites, you need to do more to fight against racism, but not that much. It's like, do it when we tell you to do it. But if we told you to do it and everyone doesn't know we told you to do it, now you're in trouble. And it's like, and I think that speaks to the chaotic nature of movement right now, which is that, there's a number of different directions that Black people want to go in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're telling white people to support, then ultimately you're telling them to get behind Black leadership. And then for them to get behind Black leadership, if they really take that serious, then sometimes it's like they're going to be told to do stuff that's going to put them in danger. I mean, in general, it's going to put them in danger. Like, to support Black people in general is going to put them in danger, right? So on the one hand, you have some people who they're really ultimately trying to pacify all of this activity by, improving, updating, and upgrading whiteness, and improving whiteness in general, so that it's not so harmful, or so that it's not so vulgar, or that it's not so offensive to Black people. But the ultimate reality is that whiteness as a category, as a status, right? Not as the color of people's skin, but whiteness as a status and as a category of privilege and power is a violent entity, it's a violent phenomenon, it's a violent historical movement. And so to then pit white people against it is necessarily going to create violent situations where white people are on the front lines against whiteness. And that's ideal. I mean, that's really ideal. It's ideal for us to have white people on the front lines against whiteness, that they would bear some of the burden of fighting against it. That doesn't mean that they, just act on their own and they don't connect with what we're trying to do, that they don't connect with the goals that we set, that they don't connect with the leadership that we organize. But in as much as we're disorganized in our leadership, in as much as we're moving in different directions, they're going to be confused. They're going to go in the different directions. And I think, it really comes down to your school of thought. And I think what Malcolm is articulating for us is that that they should be utilized, that they do have important roles that they could play if they're accountable to Black militant leadership, not merely accountable to Black liberals, because we know how critical Malcolm was of the quote unquote civil rights movement. We know how critical he was of the Big Six, for example, right? And one could arguably say that, the $1 million given to the Big Six, or however much was given to the Big Six by this white man, that was white allyship, and I think that's what liberal Black people are trying to say when they're talking about, this anti-racist education that they discuss, right? So we find them looking for ways to take the movement of the empire and call it allyship, right? To take, white liberalism and call it allyship. And that's problematic, to say the least, you know what I mean? And that's them literally collaborating with the enemy of Black progress, with the enemy of Black quality of life and Black liberation. They're literally collaborating. These are Black people collaborating with the forces of whiteness. Now, with respect to what Malcolm is talking about, he's talking about white people checking in with Black militant leaders and providing, doing critical tasks that only a white person can do, like infiltrating the KKK. Now, if we look at that kind of thing, or even today with respect to the protests, right, it's ideal for white people to be on the front line. It's ideal for them to take a lot of the risk, right? So if and you always have these liberal Blacks that are talking about, how vulnerable Black people are, and how vulnerable undocumented people are, and how vulnerable people of color are, and how white people put them at risk, and this, that, and the third, right? But if you really believe that they're vulnerable, then it shouldn't be confusing to you or illogical to you that you would have white people on the front line. That's important. So with respect to this woman who, allegedly lit this Wendy's on fire, I don't think there's anything beneficial for Black people to collaborate with the state in railroading a white person who actually was doing something to fight back, who was doing something to fight against white hegemony. And that's how I understand it. I understand it as, this was, if this, and there people are saying this was his girlfriend or what have you. The way I understand it is she was fighting back for something that happened to a Black person that she cared about. Now, I feel like that's way better than, teaching white people to be more culturally sensitive while they maintain power and hegemony over us, while they maintain fancy houses, while they maintain executive director positions in nonprofits, while they maintain these positions of great influence and power. I don't really care about their cultural education. I don't really care about their cultural sensitivity. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then when they're ready to fight back, to me that has value, because ultimately, ultimately we need them to be engaged so that all of our militants don't go down in one battle. Like, if you really think about it, the way that they have Black people under siege, the Black militants, if we all got together and went out into battle, we would be isolated, we would be, surrounded, outnumbered, etc. Right? So one of the important strategic measures is to have reliable white fighters amongst you. That doesn't mean that they're going to be a part of all the inner workings of your organizing. That doesn't mean they're going to be a part of all of your discussions. That doesn't mean that you're going to look at them as equal in the struggle to Black militants. But what it means is they have an important role to play. And as the things become more disciplined and more organized, then I think their role will become more clear, more focused, and it'll be subject to less of this kind of confusion, because when we have some better and more clear direction and leadership, then you can see who they're accountable. Okay, well, they're accountable to this group. They're following the direction of this group, or they're following the direction of this Black leader, etc. Right? Which is important. But right now, as Black people are not moving in a cohesive direction, there's still some degree of confusion about the direction things should go. Then naturally there's going to be confusion about what white people should do. And I think that, Malcolm is setting the tone. Malcolm is telling us here are some good things that they can do, and he makes these points in the context of, he mentions SNCC, and he mentions the nonviolent efforts, but he also clearly says that he does not believe that the like hardline racist, white racist elements that he believes that they're too morally corrupt to be moved by nonviolence. Right? So therefore, another type of organizing must happen. So if we take Malcolm's school of thought, Malcolm is telling us that the white allies must be mobilized and organized into militancy, and they must be led by Black militants, and that this idea of, moralizing this cultural sensitivity is a futile approach, because the hardline white racist elements are not going to be moved by that. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, no, even like that thing, that point you mentioned about, because you hear this criticism online, like, by liberals and reactionaries that somehow if you let white people go into the front lines, you're somehow taking away Black people's autonomy. Like, this is our fight and we're not using, we don't need anybody else. And while that's true to an extent, I think we have to kind of look at it as it's actually an intelligent and strategic move on our part to be able to utilize white bodies on the front lines to exhaust like state violence and state resources, and also to direct white people to disrupt their own communities. Like, instead of gentrifying ours or whatever, send them to like their own communities, their own formations, the KKK, and have them like make disruptions there. And I think that is also kind of an autonomy on our part. But I think this is why we have this, there's just like, just silly, just discourse about this, very reactionary, that we shouldn't have white people on the front lines, when really it's intelligent on our part to do so, to direct them. Tandine, if you want to point as well.
I had a few different points. Hopefully folks got patience, but I'll try my best to be quick. I'll provide some steps. Step number one, well, there's a few different things. First, let me talk about how there is two different types of whites we're talking about, but broadly, white Muslims have a specific function when we're talking about Islam and political struggle. And there's whites in the struggle in general. And there's actually a gap there. Unfortunately, Muslims, American Muslims are kind of super defensive about race talk. Whenever there is a conversation on race, they don't actually directly confront the topic in a way that there is confidence in analysis and things like that. There's always this defensive-ness from everyone, not just white people. So white people go around are just confused about what to do, etc. There's this respectability thing where, all the typical, excerpts are used to talk about how everything is equal, etc. And everyone knows that the world is unequal. Everyone knows so clearly, they know, they understand that the world is racist. They understand that there's genocide happening as we're speaking. So it's not an unknown fact. It's just people are actually doing this pretend game of equality while they're using the discourse to do that. We have to confront that very directly as an open conversation, not to just make white people just feel bad. What's that gonna do for us? So the first step so now talking about white Muslims, the first thing that they should know that they're white, step one. And how do you know that you're white? Not because through a paradigm of multiculturalism, but through whether cops consider you white or not. That's really the test. What race am I? What do cops say? When I'm walking down, how do the cops are going to treat me? So your 2 drops of racial, whatever, I'm not really interested in your multicultural, exotic ethnicity, right? I'm interested in whether you first, step one, you understand that you're white and the state considers you white. That's number one. If you're not there, you're already behind in the game. Number 2, once that's acknowledged, we have a conversation about how we engage in Islamic struggle. What is the different roles that we can play? See? So this whole the other thing is liberals will always make white people feel guilty. This is the liberal Muslims and the liberal Black people. They want to make white people feel guilty to paralyze them. So then white liberals are encouraged because they're like, well, I don't have to do anything. Nah, I want you to go to your granddaddy's bank account and send some checks to the real struggle. That's what I want you to do, and understand that you're white and understand that you have inheritance. That's property, that's power. We have to understand how power works. Military power doesn't come out of the vacuum. Institutional power does not come out of the vacuum. We're doing a fundraiser now. A comparative Islamic institution has a $1 million budget right now as we speak, yearly budget. They produce much less effective material than we do by simply putting together non-white money, okay, of 5 individuals per month, coffee money. That's how we produce material. So this is significant, and it's something that they have to understand. White Muslims have to realize they're white if the cops identify them as white. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in, multicultural talk. That's really boring. That's not fun. That's not politically important or significant. Now, the question of white infiltrators is really significant. Now we're talking about next level, the kinds of politically, we're talking about Marilyn Buck type people. We're talking about Bernadine Dorn. We're talking about Geo, who came up last time. We're talking about real people who are interested in actual fight back against white supremacy, and knowing that in order to abolish themselves in terms of within the structure, they have to engage in a dynamic struggle. So they know very clearly their role, and they're very open. Step number 2, you have to be open to critique. You have to be open to the understanding of positional critique. That doesn't mean it's just a moral condemnation. That doesn't mean we're interested in making you feel guilty. You should not feel guilty. You should actually be, hey, I'm white. I got some of these advantages. Let me use that in order to engage in the struggle. That's really significant. Some of the journalists that Malcolm was communicating with, even during the time of the nation and then after in particular, were people like, M.S. Handler, he was a white man who Malcolm trusted with information. That is precisely whom Malcolm is talking about in this interview, that he talked to certain people who understood their roles. And so this is very, very significant. So we cannot allow a horrible, unthinking liberal politics to use race now against us. Me and Hannibal has been in struggle. This is one of the things I still remember. Hannibal was so dynamic. Like, we were in San Francisco. The police were trying to kettle us basically. And Hannibal took the leadership of saying, all the white people go to the front. And they all actually listened, and they actually moved to the front. And it actually allowed us to escape that situation, because the police was nicer to white folks in that particular instance. And we knew from their position in that block that they would be. And so these are important things that we're talking about, details of tactics. We're talking about much more. Unfortunately, American Muslims are really behind because they're not in the struggle. They're doing talks. They're not in the struggle, or they're doing conversations about some campaign they're going to support, which is protected by the police anyway. So they don't have to engage in these kinds of conversations, right? So that's really significant. The other thing is we have to really be clear about intelligence. We have to really be clear that there is already intelligence that works against us. So we have to counter that intelligence. And whites can provide us tremendous institutional help by being that race trader in the system. And that's really significant for us. This doesn't mean this just means that your iman is better because you understand how Allah made you and what the situation that you have, and you're willing to purify that situation by engaging in struggle. That's the Islamic imperative. Right? Doesn't mean we're treating you, we're made differently, and we're faced with different levels of suffering and struggle, etc. So, that's really the honest and sincere way. Like, I'm not interested in sugarcoating things for white Muslims. That really needs to stop. Point blank. That needs to stop right away. We're not going to sugarcoat things to make white people feel comfortable because all of a sudden they have a name now with the Muslim, tone, and that doesn't stop us from us calling them their position and then trying to educate and having a real conversation about what does that mean in relation to struggle. So this is something that someone just honest should understand. This is not even this is not a condemnation. So really, that's really the main important part. So we need to stop allowing white folks to participate in multiculturalism through the discourse of Islam. That's number one. Number two, they have to understand their role within the struggle. Number three, those whites who are outside of Islam and have been helping the struggle are really significant and important, and Muslims should give dawah to them. So they actually come to a real understanding of what it means to engage.
Yeah. Very important point. I just want to remind the people who are watching, if you guys have comments or questions, please make sure to comment them and post them. We really want to engage with them. So inshallah, we have our final clip that we want to show from the interview. And then after that, we'll go into like a brief overview and summary of the people we'll be discussing. So.
Can you give me some specific ideas of what you would do?
No, I wouldn't give any specific ideas of what should be done or how we would go about doing it. but I can say that our people have been in the armed services. We have many Negroes in this country who know every type of fighting tactic imaginable in warfare. And if they can go into Korea and South Vietnam and Laos and train others in guerrilla warfare, they can come right over here and train our own people in defense tactics that can bring an end to this Klan-like brutality. Instead of our people continuing to let the Klan and these other racist elements intimidate us with murder and organized brutality, if the Klan knows that we will retaliate, that we can retaliate and will retaliate and do unto them as they have been doing unto us, we feel that that in itself will be sufficient to hold them in check. And if the government doesn't want this type of situation to develop, then it is up to the United States government to answer the plea of James Foreman and the other Negro leaders in the South and give them federal troops to protect the lives and property of our people. Those from outside would go in for the purpose of organizing the self-defense units. And one of the steps in that organization involves making the Negroes in Mississippi see that they are within their rights to defend themselves rather than always allow themselves to be the victims of the attacks by the Klan and the White Citizens Council and other racist elements.
When you say defend themselves, what sort of methods of defense are you advocating?
By any means necessary. Our goal is to force the United States government to take its role as a government and take its responsibility as a government and occupy the state of Mississippi and give our people the protection that they cannot get under the police system that now exists in that state.
Yeah, no, but very important points from Malcolm. Very important points from Malcolm about defense tactics and letting white people in the state be aware of the people that they're oppressing and killing, our ability to retaliate back. So, and I think what comes to mind is the kind of discussion and that's been happening around mosque or masajid talking about defending ourselves, defending community from, white supremacist shooters or the police or, FBI agents. And a way that one point that's been used to kind of paralyze Muslim communities within these masajid from kind of organizing a self-defense with arms is that somehow if we let white society and the state know that we are armed and ready for defense, that they'll somehow exacerbate their oppression or whatnot, not understanding that you already live within a political economy that is anti-Black, that is participating in a war on terror, a war on Islam. Like these things already exist, and whatever steps you take to kind of defend yourself isn't a step for exacerbation, but it's a way to let your enemies basically put them in check, so they know when not to kind of retaliate, and know kind of like more as a way to kind of also discipline their response. So I think this is a very important conversation that's been happening right now, just currently. And I think what I see in a lot of masajid circles, it's just like kind of this paralyzing feeling about not wanting to organize for community self-defense, because in lieu of being even further more targeted and oppressed. So if you guys want to go ahead and add to that.
We'll go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so a couple of things. One, I'd like to think on that question of, having police in the masajid, and I think that's an important question, because whenever you talk about self-determination, organizing the community, organizing the community to be self-reliant, to rely on people within the community, to rely on other Muslims, etc. and taking serious the organizing of that kind of defense, or taking serious, the organizing of people who could have a capacity to respond, it's generally looked at with distrust and disdain, as if every every Muslim who brings up such a conversation or comments on it or is passionate about it, etc., is they're all undercover FBI, right? And that's the attitude that people take, that, oh, this is an entrapment case. They just want to get the Muslims caught up in some type of FBI case, right? And those same people who argue that self-determination, self-reliance is an effort by the FBI to trap them are the same ones who invite the police into the masjid, which is like a bit schizophrenic when you think about it, because you're saying at the higher level of federal government, you don't trust the government. Yet you trust the people who actually take orders from them, which is a bit confusing to me. And I think it comes down to a fear. I think a lot of people are really afraid. I think a lot of people are really afraid to be perceived as a quote unquote terrorist, because if they defend each other, if they defend themselves, if they defend their masajid, if they stand up for Allah's rights and Allah's laws, then now they're going to be looked at as a terrorist. And now they're going to have to go through some persecution for being steadfast in Islam. So it'll be easier and smoother just to bring in the police and allow the police to be their protector, And we have to consider the fact that we're taught don't take the disbeliever as a protecting ally, right? Don't take the disbeliever as a wali. That doesn't mean don't be friends with your neighbor. It means don't rely on them to protect you. It means don't rely on them to be your first line of defense. Don't rely on them to have power over you in your daily life, in the protection of the women and children, in the protection of the community in general, in the protection of anything that's under the responsibility of the Muslims, right? But somehow people just like look right over that and invite in the police, and you even find people giving very broad, generalized statements about them. Like you find people like Imam Zaid. He made this statement about when a few years back when these police were killed. He made this statement about how the overwhelming majority of police carry out their duties in this, disciplined, honorable way. And I'm paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not misquoting him. But, basically saying something to the nature that the overwhelming majority of them are, righteous, basically, and that they do their job right, and they do it good, and et cetera, et cetera. And you find this argument as well coming from people like Omar Suleiman, who says, we know their hearts are with us. We know their hearts are good. And I don't know what kind of man can actually perceive into another man's heart or another person's heart. That's, really, that's of the role of Allah. Allah is the one who knows what's in a person's heart, right? Allah is the one who is the determiner of people's hearts. So we find these kind of generalized statements, but if we compare them against, the statistics of police violence, right? And if we compare them against the way that police protect each other, the way that police have this no snitching policy, right? So police love to encourage us to, if you see something, say something. Yet they can be on the job all day and see all kinds of abuses and never say anything.
Right.
They can be on a job for decades and see all types of abuses, and see all types of criminal activity on the part of police
Right.
and never say anything,
Yeah.
right? So when you talk about, you know, like that Stop Snitching campaign, like when you know, a few years back, there used to be all these, you see all these T-shirts that say "Stop Snitching," etc., and police were like very much against it because, you know, they really wanted everyone to give them information constantly. They want all type of details about the community. They want to know who's saying what, who's doing what, et cetera, et cetera. Yet when it comes to them actually breaking the law that they swear to uphold, when it comes to them breaking the law that they are paid to enforce, right? When it comes to them violating people that they're paid to protect, that they swear to protect, and they violate, beat, abuse, rape, murder, kidnap, the other ones don't say anything.
Right.
Mhm.
So how is
Yeah.
it possible for the overwhelming majority of them to be good, and yet they allow this minority few to get away with all of this criminal activity? That doesn't really make any sense to me, you know. And then maybe that's one for the philosophers, but common sense would tell me, you know, common sense would tell me that if we even just for a moment follow that line of reasoning and say that the few are the few are the ones who are doing the criminal activity, then how in the world are the majority going along with it? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? When they're all sworn and paid to protect us, to uphold the law, etc. We have to we have to think a little bit more critically than that, you know, and we find that that kind of rhetoric is something that's used as a mechanism of hegemony to keep people from communities from being self-organized, self-reliant, right? And you know, Malcolm was talking about this, and I know we have a comment on this particular quote, so I'm
Yeah, I
gonna
was
read
gonna
the
say something
comment.
about that, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to read the comment because I also want to respond to that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And so the comment says Malcolm is here sort of assuming Black Southerners hadn't been fighting back. It's a bit patronizing, actually, now that I listen to it. My dad's family is from Mississippi, and way back like 90 years ago, I had a cousin stab a white man in the neck after he attacked his brother. My cousin had to flee to Chicago. He survived because he was hidden by a white family until he was able to get out of town. And so my response to that would be, there is a bit of a sting when we think about saying that we're not having a proper defensive response. My family also comes from the South, from Louisiana, and my grandfather himself had to flee certain areas down there because of things that, you know, he was targeted and he defended himself, you know, and he went through a lot of things down there, you know. He went through forced shock therapy and other things like that. And but one thing I would say, you know, I think within your comment lies the truth of what Malcolm says, you know, because your cousin had to flee to Chicago. And that already indicates, you know, he survived because he was hidden by a white family. And that already indicates what Malcolm is talking about. Malcolm is talking about organizing defense forces to where your cousin wouldn't have had to flee, to where your cousin could defend himself, and these defense forces or defense units could step up and have your cousin's back, or whoever the individual may be, they could step up to protect their rights. Because what did your cousin lose when he had to flee? You know, perhaps he had to leave behind some property or some land that could have been very valuable to him. And so I think that's what Malcolm is saying here, is that, you know, once you organize these kind of defense units and groups like the KKK see that you have a readiness and a willingness to deal with them head on and directly, and that you're not merely going to run, or that you're not going to hide, that you're not going to seek, that you're not going to simply rely on the protection of the federal government, but that you're going to defend each other, you're going to defend yourselves, you're going to defend your land, you're going to defend your homes. When they see that, that's going to change their whole attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to kind of paraphrase Robert F. Williams, where he says, and Tanzina always reminds me of this point, which I love. It's a great point, you know, because Robert Williams teaches us that a white supremacist who believes that they, as a white person, are superior to a black person, they're not going to trade their superior white life, right? They're not going to risk their life as a superior white person to take the life of an inferior black person. If they believe you to be inferior, they're not going to trade their superior life to hurt you. So when they're faced with the actual threat of losing their life, and when they're faced with the actual reality that they could get hurt trying to hurt you, it's going to change their whole attitude. You know, and I think, you know, that's an excellent point that Robert Williams makes, and I think it's, you know, something to consider here. And I feel that that's consistent with what Malcolm's saying about how, you know, that's going to change the attitude of people in the KKK, you know. And you know, one of my ancestors, Rosie Chapman, also had to leave. And I'm going off my father's making a comment here, so I want to just drop that in there too. You know, with our connection to the South, you know, that Rosie Chapman, she had to leave her county after protecting her son. You know what I mean? And so, you know, one of the reasons why I grew up out this way and not in Louisiana, for example, is that some of us had to flee. You know, and that was the reality. And I think, you know, to some degree, in some places, it's still a reality that exists. You know, when we see, and you know, California is not better. You know, there's certain areas that might be better, but in general, it's not better. We found that there was black men found hanging in California, and the police labeled it as suicide. Now,
Yeah,
I don't
too.
care what, I'm sorry, and I don't want to be insensitive or insulting to anyone. I don't care what anyone says. There's no black man, no matter what he's going through, that's going to just hang himself from a tree like that.
Yeah.
That's not how we do it. You know, he might hang himself. Yeah, there's black men who have hung themselves, absolutely. But he's not going to go out and hang himself from a tree.
Right.
I'm sorry, you know, and I don't mean to be insensitive, but if someone's loved one died like that, it's a terrible thing. But the reality is that's absolutely highly suspicious. You know what I mean? And so we have that in California. We have that in some parts of California. But I think, you know, there's definitely more concentration of it. And a few years back, I saw this film. I think it was called like Banished or something to that nature, and it was just specifically about these black people who trace back the land that their black relatives owned in the South, and through violent means they were removed from their land. And there's all this land in the South that used to belong to black people, or belong, you know, however much it can belong to a person. There was land that you know, black people were living on. There was land that, you know, black people were raising their families on, et cetera, that was taken from them, that they were ran off of by groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and that has contributed a great deal to some concentration of resources and power in that area. You know, they use that tactic as a means of concentrating power in those areas, in which they can use then to leverage against the federal government, leverage against politicians, et cetera, et cetera. They use that as a base of power to organize, as a base of power to radicalize and to crystallize their agenda. You know, and I think that this is something that you know, if we take serious what Malcolm's saying, this is a means of breaking up that concentrated power that's in the hands of those hardline white racists. You know?
Yeah, I would just like to add, well, first of all, sister, I mean, it's great to see that you mentioned that you recently became Muslim. So I hope, inshallah, Allah continues to keep you in the fold of Islam and that you connect with all the right Muslims, inshallah. Um, I want to just say that I think Malcolm's comment and Hannibal's point about Robert F. Williams, they both of them later became kind of involved together in an organization called RAM, which we're going to talk about next week, and is going to be kind of like they were both interested. So Malcolm was not saying that in the South there was not a rebellion or a fight back, but he wanted to identify those elements and organize them and help them organize. And the Southern militant students were interested in communicating with Malcolm. So that's what was happening in that instance. He was actually basically saying what you're saying, that there are all these Southern fighters who were not impressed by nonviolent protests. They wanted to retaliate against the violence, and therefore they actually needed folks like Malcolm to come in and influence that. So, I think that's an important point. The only thing I would add, I mean, Hannibal covered so much ground here about the defense tactics, and Israel, you as well. I would just add that state to state, for a contemporary situation, state to state, it varies a little bit about, like, for example, people normally easily and quickly just go to the gun. I think you need to understand what it means to have a life of defense where all other kinds of weapons are important as well for your protection. So, in certain kind of states where carrying open carry is not possible, or it's actually not that wise to only rely on something that you can't really quickly access. So I would promote all our brothers and sisters to learn how to use bats, how to use sticks, how to use all kinds of things that is going to help you defend, and understand also each state's particular laws and those things. We're going to actually offer workshops about know your rights and things like that fairly soon in Milestones, and it's going to help you understand those details. I don't want to just glorify only the gun in a kind of weird way where there's not a full consideration of how to have a life that is strong and be able to defend ourselves, and that's really significant. And of course, those states where you can carry in that way, where it's useful, of course, do so. So that would be my thing about in terms of a basic life of Muslims who are, scattered in different states, and there are different rules that are in place. Inshallah. I don't really have much else to add on this point.
Yeah, and just to add one little more point to that before we start to wrap up, I see one of the comments, mind protection. Have a state of mind of protecting your family, protecting your community, protecting yourself. Try to keep yourself in shape as much as you can. Be aware of preventative measures, because sometimes people immediately go to, well, like the most extreme scenarios, but a lot of times it's not the most extreme scenarios.
Yeah.
A lot of times there's a lot of little microaggressions that lead you into feeling like you're subdued, lead you into feeling that you're overwhelmed or that you're attacked, etc. And so, I think there's a lot of steps that people can take, but it starts in the mind. It starts with thinking about taking responsibility for your well-being, right? Even if you just look at it at that level, taking responsibility of your well-being, right? Who outside of yourself, who outside of your community is going to be more concerned with your well-being? We can't think like that. We have to think like, well, I have myself, I have control over myself. So I'm going to start with, how can I rely on myself for my well-being, and then my community and those who we're connected to, and so I think that's an important thing. There's a book, We Will Shoot Back, which is a great resource in like the history of some self-defense units and forces that were organized in defense of movement, in defense of Black people's rights and property and their bodies, etc. So that's an important point. And we're gonna also touch on this subject in one of our future and actually the next episode we're gonna discuss a couple of things that relate to this, one of them being Black fighting formations by Russell Schultz. But I see that we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to quickly try to do an overview of what we got coming. So overview being, we're dealing with this series of the successors of Malcolm X. And one of the things, to understand why we pick certain people, I wrote a little bit that I'm just going to read to you guys, inshallah, for the sake of expediency. Malcolm talks about Islam as his personal morals and religious philosophy. He also talks to us about re-educating Blacks to change their attitude towards themselves. He talks about the necessity for discipline in the fight against white racists. And even though he's mentioned in some speeches to leave religion at home, with careful examination, we find that the kind of struggle he was describing and promoting to us was consistent with Islamic struggle. When we examine the preceding generation of Black leadership after Malcolm, we find the ones who embrace his morals of Islamic self-discipline carry forward his militancy beyond any of their contemporaries. Amir Abdul Malik Ali constantly reminds us that taking his militancy without his morals leads to fragile structures, contradictions that are easy for the oppressor to use against us, and hypocrisies that demoralize movement. It is our intention to use this series to highlight some, though not all, of the people who carried on that legacy. We want to highlight people who have played important roles in our history and have provided for us different examples of Malcolm's approach. This is not an exhaustive presentation on everyone who carried on that legacy. These are some of the people who greatly inspired us and whom we believe deserve more attention and recognition in our history. We will be bringing on guests who can provide much deeper insight into this history than ourselves. Our main goal is to keep this legacy alive and carry it on to future generations. We are not here to present ourselves as experts or authorities, but to present some of the people who have been great inspirations and examples of dedication and self-sacrifice. Let us take the struggle to a higher level, as Imam Jamil Al-Amin teaches us. So that's like a basic overview of how we're looking at Malcolm's successors, and some of the people that we're going to be talking about. Sekou Odinga, who spent 33 years in prison for allegedly breaking Assata Shakur out of prison. We're going to talk about Russell Maroon Schultz, who is today in prison and in Pennsylvania, and he's known as Maroon because of how many times he's actually broken himself out of prison. And he's in prison for the alleged murder of a police officer in retaliation for a young Black boy that was murdered, along with two other brothers. But we're specifically going to focus on Russell Maroon Schultz because some of his writing has been very influential on some of us. And we're also going to talk about Jalil Muntaqim, who is today still remains as a political prisoner after, I believe, 40 some odd years. And so just given the time that we have, we're a bit over time. So I wanted to just be brief about that. And then Tanzine, can you tell us a little bit about the other people we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so inshallah, next week we're covering me and Hannibal. Hannibal just mentioned that he's going to talk about the Black fighting formations. And I'm going to be next week talking about Muhammad Ahmed, whose non-Muslim name was Max Stanford, who was the organizer and founder for Revolutionary Action Movement. He was a very interesting figure because he was sort of the in-between figure between Malcolm and then later on all the stuff that happens, because in Revolutionary Action Movement was formed and Malcolm was its advisor, international spokesperson, and also Robert F. Williams, we just mentioned. So they were actually both working with these two elders at the time. And not many people know about this particular organization, but also how they used a kind of productive generative infiltration to revolutionize and radicalize various forms of Black groups at the time. And so very interesting tactically. And his text is very important because it provides history of various organizations, their pros and cons basically, and to understand and situate our struggle. So that's something that we're going to discuss next time. Then we're going to have a middle session on August 1st with Ward Churchill to discuss COINTELPRO, which is a program by the feds about surveillance and targeting and assassination, all of those things that different militant struggles had to face. And so we understand that this has been much more expanded now with the counterterrorism. So there's a direct link between counterterrorism and COINTELPRO. So we want to educate folks and understand this, and we're going to continue those conversations. That's going to be the in-between stage. We're going to learn about how that took place. We're also going to actually cover our elder and dear sister, Safia Bukhari. That's going to be on August 15th. We're going to have a conversation about her. There's a good chance that our brother Hakeem Muhammad and I will be discussing this, and maybe brother Abdul Rahman as well. And Safia Bukhari was a tremendous figure, a huge organizer in many organizations, including the Panthers. She was part of the BLA and Republic of New Africa, and then inside prison. She was a huge organizer for Muslims and other prisoners. And, she's a very interesting figure, actually, because there's a connection between not just Malcolm, but directly with Sayyid Qutb. She had encountered the usefulness of Islam by reading Sayyid Qutb's brother's book, Muhammad Qutb's book on Islam. And she talks about how that influenced our thinking of faith and how there is no contradiction between how she conceptualized Black liberation and Islamic politics or Islamic ethics. So this is something very significant to discuss. So that's something we're going to cover. And I think Isra, you want to kind of close this off?
Yeah. So inshallah, our last episode, we'll be discussing Imam Jamil al-Amin, also known as H. Rap Brown, who was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Obviously, he's a very influential figure, probably the most kind of important imam living today with his work and history from Singh to the BLA to Darul Islam, and also his conversion to Islam while in Attica prison. Inshallah, we'll be joined with Amir Abdul Malik Ali for that conversation. You guys have seen him here before, a very good and dedicated brother. So we'll be having that last episode on August 22nd, same time, inshallah. So I'll make sure also to post kind of a schedule on the event page and also our Facebook, so you guys are aware. With that, we're going to be ending. I want to say Jazakallah khair to everyone who's tuned in for your engagement. We very much appreciate your participation, your attendance. I also want to thank my co-panelists, Tanzeen Doha and Brother Hanbal, for being here, and also just from learning you guys is a very it's an honor and pleasure. Yeah, so inshallah, join us next Saturday for the episode on Ram and Muhammad Ahmad and everything. So if you guys have any last things to say, Hanbal or Tanzeen.
Donate. We got a fundraiser up. Like Tanzeen was saying, most of this stuff we do by rubbing some coins together and praying, So donate, because we're not balling. We're not rich people at all. Like, we're people who are struggling financially, and somehow we, through faith and commitment to this struggle, we've been able to be consistent with some of these things. And just the inspiration that we got from some of this history has been enough to propel us. But it's still difficult, and it's not free, and we definitely want to do more things. So if you can, go to our page, Milestones in Black Dawah is the name of the fundraiser on LaunchGood. Get on there, put 50 cents, put $2, put $3,000, whatever you can do. Inshallah, may Allah bless you. Thank you, Jazakallah khair.
Inshallah, I encourage all the white Muslims to donate, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah, I'll also be sending emails
all
for
the folks, everybody, everybody who likes our programming. We're bringing something and we're not controlled by anybody other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're not gonna be compromising. We're not gonna have anybody on our collective or boards that are connected to random things that are not good for the community. So we're really trying to build with other organizations, Black Dawah Network being one, and it's a donation for both the projects. So we really want support, because we want to create social programs and really create a base at places that we've been active at. So it will be super helpful if you guys think of it as a positive thing. And I think that's a really one direct way to support these projects, inshallah.
Inshallah, sounds good. And again, the link is on our Facebook page, but also send an email out. Also, we have, after we end this webinar, we're going to have a post-attendee survey. So please fill that out just so we can hear your guys' feedback. But again, Jazakallah khair for attending, again, for my co-panelists for being here. And we hope to see you guys next week, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.